John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah.
Welcome to War of the Rebellion, Stories of the Civil War. I am your host, Leon, and this is a reading of the history of the 72nd Indiana Infantry Regiment of the Mounted Lightning Brigade. And this is Chapter 21, August 6th to September 14th, 1863. Begin second year's service at Dechard. Beautiful camp, good and abundant water. Comrades join us. A big mouse. Bragg's retreat from Tullahoma. Lightning Brigade move over the mountains. Attack Chattanooga, and Bragg evacuates the city. Dry Valley and Racy incidents. Big corn, big sheep, big eating. How we got our mutton. A tussle with the Bell-Wether Hard on the old sow. Crossing the Tennessee River. The feint deceives Bragg. He retreats and the Lightning Brigade flashes after him to Tunnel Hill, striking the rebels in force. Bad mistake of Rosecrans, who will not be convinced that we have found the enemy in force in front. We are ordered to Lafayette. Bloody Battle of Rock Springs. We escape from the enemy after night. 72nd Foragers taken before General Rosecrans. Sergeant Wakeman introduces Capt Smith to Colonel Miller. We begin our second year's service in our camp at Dechard. Our summer's service on horseback in the pure air and on fresh rations most of the time has worked out the poison of Murfreesboro from our blood. The camp at this place was a beautiful one, situated on a gently sloping hillside abundantly shaded, near a clear stream of water, which flowed from a large fountain which was almost bottomless and burst up from a fissure in the rocks, furnishing water for bathing, washing, and other purposes. Many of our comrades, who had been left behind sick, came back to us at this camp, and bathing in the pure water, and the abundant use of peaches and blackberries, which were plenty, soon put them all in the best of fighting trim. We never saw command in better spirits. We cannot forbear relating an anecdote, showing on what intimate terms the men and officers were. The stream above mentioned ran between our horse quarters and regimental headquarters. William Grismar, Company K, was put on guard by the side of the creek. Colonel Miller was then in command of the brigade and Lieutenant Colonel Kirkpatrick in command of the regiment. Just at daylight, Colonel Patrick came out of his tent, stretched himself, and caught sight of Grismar, who immediately cocked his gun and pointed it to a big drift pile in the creek, and called to the colonel to come there. The colonel started, and Grismar motioned for him to keep as quiet as possible. The colonel came up on tiptoe, Grismar still holding his gun leveled at the drift, and motioned for the colonel to get down. And all ears, eyes, and attention, the colonel got down on his knees, began to peer under the logs, and whispered, "What is it?" Grismar whispered back, "Just tear that drift pile open, and you will find the damnedest, biggest mouse you ever saw." The colonel said, "That'll do," tossed Grismar his pocket knife, and told him to say no more about it. Bragg began his retreat from Tullahoma on the night of June 28th, and never stopped until he put the Cumberland Mountains between Rosecrans and himself, making his headquarters at Chattanooga. Rosecrans followed and camped his army at the western base of the mountains, his left wing resting on Manchester, center at Dechard, and right south of Winchester. It took Rosecrans until the middle of August to get up supplies enough to justify him in climbing the mountains. On August 16th, we broke camp at Dechard, moved along the base of the mountains for 4 miles north, and began to ascent. Every man was ordered to dismount and lead his horse. It was 2 miles from where we started to the top, steep and rocky. As we had not walked so far for a long time, we were very tired when we reached the summit. All the lovers of grand and beautiful scenery were richly paid by the sublime and far-reaching views spread out in the direction whence we had come. We passed University Heights and camped at Tracy City. It may be proper to state that the plan of the campaign was to make a strong feint at and above Chattanooga, while the main body of our army was to cross the Tennessee River away below Chattanooga and come up on the east side of the river. The portion of the army making this feint was our brigade, now composed of the 17th and 72nd Indiana, the 92nd, 98th, and 123rd Illinois, and the 18th Indiana Battery, and General Wagoner's Brigade of Infantry. General Wagoner started from Manchester, when we started from Dechard, but we had to lie in camp at Tracy City and wait for him to catch up. On the 18th, we moved forward, and on the 19th, near noon, reached the edge of the mountain bordering the Sequatchie Valley, which is one of the finest and richest valleys in the world. The rebels had every road and crossing leading out of it to the west strongly picketed, and the valley was full of the enemy. We struck the valley at Sherman's Crossing, the 92nd Illinois in advance. The rebel vedettes on the hill reported our advance in time for the rebels in the valley to concentrate and get ready for us by the time we descended the mountain. When the 92nd struck the rebel pickets, it came promptly to a halt. This so exasperated Colonel Wilder that he ordered it to stand aside and ordered the 72nd forward. As soon as we reached the head of the column, Colonel Miller took Companies A, F, D, and I. Company I kept Captain McMurdy advance guard and struck across the valley. The command had not gone far until the road forked, and it was necessary to send a company on each branch. Company I kept straight across the valley, which was about 3 miles wide at this point, while Company A made a lively chase after some rebels on the other branch of the road, in which Albert Sigers killed a rebel. Company D run on to a schoolhouse where some rebel soldiers were holding a conference over some Union home guards they had just captured. The rebels had decided that the home guards should die, but Captain Thompson came upon them so suddenly that it broke up the meeting, turned the tables completely, and the captain left the home guards guarding the rebels. When Captain McMurdy, with Company I, reached the Sequatchie River, they found it a wide, deep stream, having bluff banks, each side skirted with thick brush and timber. The road struck the creek and turned squarely to the right, passing down the stream some distance to a ford. Here the rebels undertook to make a stand and opened fire on I as they came around a curve in the road. But the company, without a halt or a return of a shot, dashed like furies down to the ford, across the stream, up in the rear of the rebels, opened on them with their Spencers, killed 1, captured 5, and chased the terror-stricken enemy northeast, through the open country, until they reached the foot of the mountain, where the rebels scattered and hid in the brush. That was a brilliant dash performed in less time than it takes to tell it. This rapid movement brought Company I across the valley in a brief time and with little noise, and left the next rebel post further up the creek in ignorance of our movements. This post was on a road leading northwest. They had dismounted, barricaded the road with rails, and were behind them with their backs towards us, eagerly straining their eyes watching for the Yanks to come. But, Yankee-like, we slipped up behind them, and they knew nothing of our approach until we were covering them with our fatal Spencers and demanding their surrender. They made no resistance, and were all captured. The brigade went into camp at Dunlap. Kings never lived better than we did here, for grapes, peaches, and roasting ears abounded. At Dunlap we left all our trains and loaded all our traps and 5 days' rations upon our pack mules. And early on the morning of the 20th of August, we started up another range of the mountains, called Waldron's Ridge, which runs straight south to the Tennessee River at Stevenson and Bridgeport. This range was much higher, steeper and more difficult of ascent than the other one had been, and as we had to walk and lead, it was an uphill business and very exhausting. Before we got to the top, we moved rapidly, and as the ridge is only 20 miles across the summit, we reached the eastern brow that day by 4 p.m. Clark, in command of the 72nd Scouts, says, quote, "On this march, and when within about a mile of the foot of the mountain, Colonel Wilder gave me a guide, and told me to take my scouts and those of the 17th and go down the mountain, by what is known as Wildcat Trace, and get in the rear of the rebel pickets at the foot of the mountain on the road. He said that he would hold the command 1 hour for me to get position. I did so. I placed the 17th Scouts on the first road, and my scouts took the second road. We dismounted, got ready, and had just gotten to position when the advance of the column was fired on by the pickets. The fire was returned, and here came the pickets, pell-mell past us. Well, not exactly past us, for we fired into them, and some were wounded and a great many thrown from their horses and captured. I remember one who jumped over the fence into a clump of bushes, when Amos Hollingsworth jumped over after and caught him by the coat collar and seat of his trousers, and threw him out in the road. We learned by the people whose houses the frightened rebels passed after being fired on that there was not a man of them wore a hat, but that their hair stood as erect as porcupine quills. The 72nd was in advance, A, F, D, and I advance guard. We struck a heavy picket post just at the foot of the mountain, and as we charged them, about one half ran up the valley, and the other half down it. The 4 companies above named chased the squad that turned north, 12 miles before we stopped, but as our horses were already tired and theirs fresh when we started, we didn't catch any of them. Soon after, we started in pursuit of the rebels. The horse of John Young, of I, dashed ahead of all the others, and came close up to the fleeing foe. One rebel halted, and leveled his gun at Young, and Young, without halting his horse, brought his Spencer to his shoulder and fired at the rebel. At this instant, Young's horse stumbled and fell, and the rebel fell from his horse, severely wounded by Young's shot. Young was not hit by the rebel's bullet, but he was almost crushed by his horse falling on him. His leg and arm were broken, and he was otherwise bruised. As soon as Young and the rebel recovered, they talked the matter over very coolly as they lay near each other, until they were taken up. The rebel died of his wound, and Young is badly crippled for life. Yet by his energy and tact, he makes his way very well in the world, and has a good business at his home in Oakwood, Illinois. We remained all night on picket, right where we stopped. The remainder of the brigade went into camp soon after getting down from the mountain at Poe's Tavern, 15 miles above Chattanooga. At daylight, on August 21st, the brigade moved very rapidly down the valley to Chattanooga, the 72nd Scouts driving before it the pickets of the enemy at several points, capturing 30 prisoners, and came near capturing the steamboat ferry which carried the retreating pickets across the river, killing the ferrymen. The regimental scouts captured 100 horses and mules that day. The brigade came up and took position on the bluffs overlooking the city, on the northwest. Captain Lilly immediately opened fire on the city with 2 guns. That was some sort of fast day or holiday in Chattanooga, and when our shells began to drop among them, there was such a stampede for the fortifications as you never saw. The rebels replied with a battery of 32-pounders, a shell of which killed 4 horses and shattered the leg of a gunner, all belonging to the same section. Dr. Cole amputated the leg, but the soldier never rallied and soon died. Our brigade kept up a strong demonstration in the front of the city until dark, and then fell back 5 miles and camped in Dry Valley. Companies A, F, D, and I, which chased a squad of rebels 12 miles and picketed the road on the night of the 20th, moved early on the morning of the 21st, being 27 miles above Chattanooga, and we scouted slowly down the river, hunting all the fords and crossings, and getting acquainted with the country generally. We reached the camp of the regiment at 9 o'clock that night. Dry Valley was not so very dry after all, for numerous beautiful mountain streams meandered through it. The land was rich, and forage abounded. We remained here until the 29th of September, and enjoyed as much solid fun as we ever did during the same length of time while in the service. Every afternoon our battery would go to the bluff overlooking the city and shell it vigorously. The regiments of the brigade took turn about going down on foot with the battery, leaving our horses behind to give the rebels the impression that we had an infantry force, as well as artillery and cavalry. We constantly kept a strong picket force all along the river. The ridge our battery occupied each day was nearly a mile from the river. Off to the right of our position, and about halfway down the hill, was a little frame house. After a few days' shelling, with but an occasional shot from the rebels, the thing became monotonous, and our men and officers became saucy and venturesome. About the 23rd, Colonel Wilder and his staff officers, in order to get a better view of Chattanooga and surroundings, concluded to go down and get into the house. In the squad were Colonel Wilder, Captain Shields, Lieutenant Crick, and Lieutenant Newell, of the Topographical Engineers. This was a rather bold adventure, but they succeeded in getting into the house from the back way, as they supposed, unobserved. The back of the house sat on the ground, and the front part, next the river, was 3 or 4 feet from the ground. Everything was quiet about the house, but the officer saw under it a very large, old sow, serenely sleeping. The Johnnies had observed all their movements and turned a 32-pounder upon the house, and just as our heroes had secured the best positions at crack and crevice with their field glasses and had begun to survey the situation, the Johnnies let drive at them. The 32-pounder was well aimed and well timed, and came under the house. Thud. Literally blotting the old sow out of existence, and at the same instant exploding, and quicker than you could wink, pieces of the floor, hair, entrails, fresh pork, and old iron came boiling out through the roof of the house like lava from a crater. To say that the officers rolled out of that house faster than hornets ever tumbled out of a nest would be putting it rather mildly, and to say that they made good time up the hill would be true. Lieutenant Newell jumped out of the window, and in just 2 minutes by the watch was going over the brow of the hill, when Captain Rice hallooed, "Hello, Newell, what's the matter with you?" Without checking up, Newell hallooed over his shoulder as he ran, "Oh, there's nothing the matter with me, but it was a terrible hard on the old sow." On August 25th, our regiment went on a reconnaissance to Friar's Island, 12 or 15 miles from our camp. At this place there is a ford that can be crossed at ordinary stages of water. We found the ford strongly picketed, and guarded by a battery of artillery protected by earthworks. We exchanged shots across the river, which is at this point 3/4 of a mile wide, but did not attempt to cross. When we marched from Dunlop, we left our teams behind in Company E to guard them. About the 26th, Captain McMurdy gathered together all the pack mules of the brigade and started back over Waldron's Ridge for rations. From our camp, Straight across to Dunlap, it was 30 miles. We made the trip across and back in 2 days. This was repeated several times by other companies, till the 4th of September, when our teams also came across. Reconnaissances and scouting up to Friar's Island were made every day by some of the companies. On the 29th, Colonel Wilder and Miller went up and talked with the rebels across the river. Companies B and I went up there one day, dismounted, left our horses out of sight, and slipped down close to the river to see what chance there was of getting across. The enemy discovered and fired on us a while with their muskets, but did us no harm. And when they saw that we didn't mind, they turned a piece of artillery on us, and we hastily got out of the way. 2 or 3 miles further down, we saw a man washing his feet on the opposite side, and as he didn't know we were about, we fired a shot or two simply to impart to him a knowledge of our presence. He received the news violently, and tore up the earth as he pawed up the hill. Again, 2 or 3 miles below this, we saw some rebel pickets on the other side, and began to talk with them, and ascertained what regiments they were of, how long they had been stationed there, and various other bits of information. They were so friendly that we invited them to come over, pledging ourselves not to harm them. They at first agreed to come, and we dismounted, left our guns, and went down to the river to receive them. They modified their proposition and said they would meet us halfway. We also accepted this proposition. The river was a mile wide and seemed very shallow, and Sergeant McGee pulled off his clothes and waded to the middle of it. The men who were doing the talking now said that their officers would not let them come. We may here mention that our guns were so superior to theirs that our balls easily went over the river, while theirs rarely came across. We have been a farmer all our life, and point to the prairies of Indiana and Illinois with great pride as producing the best corn in the world. But we saw corn on our trip down the river on that day, beside which the best fields of Illinois and Indiana are dwarfs. The rows were 3.5 feet apart, both ways, 2 stalks to the hill, and such stalks we have never seen since. As we rode between the rows on a large horse, with a forage sack before us, most of the ears were just a convenient height to gather, but to reach many ears we had to stand up in the stirrups. One ear cut into 4 inches from the butt, measured 4 inches in diameter, and each grain was 3/4 of an inch long. We were getting our entire living off the country, and in such a valley neither man nor beast was likely to suffer. The geological formation of this valley is peculiar, and we have seen nothing like it anywhere else. Right at the base of the mountain is the beautiful little dry valley in which we are encamped. Between this and the river is a range of hills, many of them almost as high as the mountain itself. These knobs are chiefly composed of a species of quartz rock, nearly square in shape, from the size of a walnut to that of a man's head. These rocks make the hills the most difficult to climb of any we ever ascended. When the scouting party above named got opposite Chattanooga, we climbed a hill till we could look down into the rebel works, and could tell by the columns of dust that the rebel troops were moving east. Returning to camp that evening, we noticed a fine lot of sheep in a field near the picket post. We had strict orders not to leave camp after night, but the fat sheep were too great of a temptation, and a party of us determined to risk adventure to capture some mutton. And going to the field, a point of the mountain had to be climbed to avoid the pickets, and the square stones rolling under our feet with their sharp corners made the trip so toilsome that we had earned the mutton before taking it. The sheep had lain down very near the picket post, and the puzzle was how to get them away without alarming the picket. After a few whispers, we crawled up near the sheep and began to toss pebbles at them. When a sheep was struck, it got up. When about half were up, a stone struck the Bell-Wether, and he jumped up in fright, rattling his bell like the beat of a long roll until it reverberated among the hills. The pickets were up and all attention in a moment, and we thought our mutton prospects withered as we heard the pickets speculating as to what was up. We lay as flat as snakes in the grass, and still as stones until the pickets got over their alarm. The sheep, in the meantime, had all come to their feet, and by skillful tossing of stones we got them away from the picket post and drove them to the further end of the long field. There were 6 of us. We cornered the sheep and each made a dive for one. It was our fortune to seize the Bell-Wether by the collar. At a single bound he jerked us off our feet, and we fell sprawling on the ground, holding to the bell collar like grim death as we went rolling with the sheep down the steep, rough hill for some rods. The sheep on top half the time, but we were a full match for him, being on top the other half, but were terribly bruised on the square rocks. Our grip was failing, but 2 comrades came to the rescue and the prize was secured. 3 others got good ones. We skinned them in a twinkling. Practice makes perfect. But now the question is how to get them into camp. They were big, fat, and heavy, the Bell-Wether being the fattest sheep we ever saw. When strung on a rail, it was all 2 of us could do to carry one of them. As we went to the field, the side of the mountain to be ascended was not so steep as the one to be descended, and we reached the top without serious mishap. But the trouble began when we began to descend. Lights were all out in camp, and we were not certain of the direction. We began to descend, and every little bit the man at the front end of the rail, and we happened to be at that end, would find himself sitting down and scooting down the mountain on the half-sole of his pantaloons, the sheep lapping about his neck, and the man who should be at the upper end of the rail lapping around the sheep. Such service tried a soldier's bottom. When about 50 feet from the foot of the mountain, the men at the upper end of the rails seemed to let all holds go at once, and men and sheep came rolling down upon us like an avalanche, and before we could check upon, we came down in a heap against Colonel Miller's tent, bruised, bleeding, and almost as badly skinned as the sheep. When we struck the tent, the colonel started up in a terrible fright and hallooed, "Ha, there!" We held our breath for a moment, and the colonel concluded that a convalescent horse had stumbled upon the tent ropes, and he fell asleep again. We picked up our bruised and mangled forms, and also our sheep, and silently stole away. We had mutton for the inner man, and mutton soup to mollify our wounds as long as we remained in camp. On the 26th of August, Wagner's brigade came into the valley at Poe's Tavern, and made the strongest possible demonstration on the enemy along the river. On the 28th, Wagner moved down near us and shelled Chattanooga, the rebels replying but once with a small gun, and from the little attention paid us we were led to think that they had decided our attack was but a feint, and were concentrating against our main army, that was now across the river at Shell Mountain, Bridgeport, and Stevenson, 35 miles below. In order to disabuse the rebels of this idea, our trains came over the mountain, and General Wagner moved his brigade to the top of the mountain opposite the city, put up tents in plain view of the rebels, and burnt brush and log heaps as if a whole corps were in camp. On the 5th of September, to add to the demonstration, General Hazen's brigade was sent into the valley at Poe's, and shelled the woods across the river. This seemed to have the desired effect, and our pickets early that night sent information to camp that the rebels were preparing to cross. This was a cause of serious alarm to our brigade, as Wagner was on a mountain 2 miles high, and could not possibly get down in time to aid us, while Hazen, 15 miles above, could give us no immediate aid. In this situation, a corps of rebels, crossing in the night, might drive us from the valley and capture the 2 other brigades. The night was dark and favorable for the rebel advance. Our wagons were all loaded and the teams hitched to them. The pickets were doubled and a regiment sent to the river in front of the city. An unusual amount of hammering and noise continued on the rebel side opposite to us, and our teams were hurriedly starting up the mountain. It was our lot to be on picket. The noise continued late into the night, our brigade lying on arms. But the day dawned and no attack was made. We afterwards learned that the confusion was made by the rebels preparing to evacuate the city. The solid comfort we had in this valley, notwithstanding our exposed position, has been spoken of, and also the square stones and the fun we enjoyed. We will now relate an incident that combines all these, and then we are ready to go out of this valley of fatness. After leaving Dechard on the 16th of August, we never had our tents up until we reached Maysville, Alabama, October 24th. Each mess, our camp family would hitch their horses in a circle in the woods and cook, eat and sleep in the center of the circle, so in case of alarm, each could mount most speedily. To get a shady place to hitch, we had to go onto the hillside, the level ground being in cultivation. Company I was encamped in regular order. Mess I up the hill about 100 yards from the road, 2 about 25 yards further down, 3, to which we belonged, 25 yards further down, and 4 next to the road. The hill was so steep and rough that we had to scrape away the rocks to get a level place enough to sleep on. Every night, numbers of horses would get loose and wander about in the camp. Besides, there were scores of convalescent horses that had given out and were turned loose to live or die. One night, one of these horses stumbled over some fellow away up in Mess I, in Mess 1, and he jumped up in a fright and ran for his life. This scared the horse, and it came down through Mess 2 in a full run. We were awake when the man in Mess 1 scared the animal and knew from the rattle and crash of the rocks that it was coming, straight for our mess, who were all sleeping in a row, we in the middle. And as the horse swept over Mess 2, they all jumped up and hallooed as if Satan himself were after them. We jumped up and called to Mess 3, "For God's sake, save yourselves." From the additional fright given, the horse in Mess 2, he came upon Mess 3 like a whole regiment of cavalry. The men jumped up half awake. The horse stumbled and fell right into our bed, rolled over, and went rolling down through Mess 4, landing in the road at the foot of the hill. For a moment, the hair stood straight up on top of our heads as we realized how near we came to being crushed to death. But in a moment, more the thought of the ridiculous figure we cut in jumping out of bed with nothing but our hog-hair shirts on and running till our banners cracked in the wind to get out of the way of the old horse, overcame our fear, and we all roared with laughter and hallooed like Indians. Other companies joined in the jollity and kept it up for half an hour. On September 7th, our brigade moved up to the mouth of North Chickamauga Creek near Friar's Island, and Wagner's brigade moved off the mountain to the river in front of Chattanooga. In the night our brigade dug some trenches and built lunettes for the guns, and made every possible preparation for crossing at the ford just below the point of the island. Our battery shelled the enemy, and they replied with an energy that let us know they were ready. On the morning of September 8th, the brigade made ready to cross, the 17th having the advance. Its scouts undertook to swim to the island, which is about 80 rods long and 20 wide, and covered with timber, which screened our movements. The object of the scouts was to get on the island and pick off the rebel gunners. The channel on our side was not so wide as on the other, but quite deep enough just below the point of the island. The river just below the island is nearly a mile wide. In the efforts of the brave scouts to get over, their leader, Joseph C. Wilson, was drowned, but the others gained the island and a vigorous skirmish immediately opened. Our artillery did good work, but in a short time, to our agreeable astonishment, the rebel artillery limbered up and deliberately moved away. The reason for this retreat was that the rebels evacuated Chattanooga on the night of the 7th. Crittenden's corps immediately took possession and began to move east and south, and was about to cut off the rebels in our front. Hence they left, and we crossed the river at our leisure, Company C in advance. Captain Glaze says a passing column was reported to the colonel across the river, and the battery being close at hand, opened on them over the trees. In the language of a contraband picked up on the road in the rear of the column, "sich scramblin' to get away from de shells was never seen." Company C could not resist the chance for a few shots, but the enemy were in a hurry and did not return the fire. We found a few tents and some camp equipage near the forts which probably belonged to General Hardee, as his name appeared on some of the camp stools, which Captain Glaze took charge of. Of the importance of this capture of Chattanooga, with its wealth of saltpeter beds and coal, by a flank movement, we have not space to speak. Histories of the war will inform the reader that it was hailed with delight at the North, as of little and less importance than the fall of Vicksburg, and that it had a most depressing effect in the South, where the position was regarded as invincible. After the fall of this city, the Southern people said the great gate to the invasion of the South was opened wide. The only guns fired on Chattanooga were those of which we have already spoken. Crittenden entered the place without firing a gun. On page 140 of Ridpath's History of President Garfield is the following explanation. On August 16th began the movement of the army across the mountains towards the Tennessee River. The paramount effort in the manner of the advance was to deceive the enemy as to the real intention. The army made the movement along 3 separate routes. Crittenden's corps, forming the left, was to advance by a circuitous route to a point about 15 miles southwest of Chattanooga, and make his crossing of the Tennessee River there. Thomas, as our center, was to cross a little farther down, and McCook 30 miles further to the right. These real movements were to be made under cover of an apparent one. About 7,000 men marched directly to the river opposite of Chattanooga, as if a direct attack were to be made on that place. The extent of front presented, the show of strength, the vigorous shelling of the city by Wilder's artillery, the bold expression of the whole movement, constituted a brilliant feint. Bragg was deceived again. Absorbed in the operations in front of the place, he offered no resistance to the crossing of the Tennessee River by the main army. We have already told the part of the 72nd took in this famous attack on Chattanooga, by which Bragg was so alarmed that he forgot to guard his flanks. At Dechard, in his rear, we had helped to hurry him out of his stronghold at Tullahoma at Dry Valley, in his front. We have held him until he is flanked out of Chattanooga. The reader can judge whether the Lightning Brigade and the 72nd have a right to be proud of this part of their history. We have helped to open the gate in this Switzerland of America for the invasion of East Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia. But now, move on. On the 9th, all our trains came up and crossed at the same ford as we did, and we drew 7 days' rations, and on the 10th we moved on to Ringgold, and camped just inside the Georgia state line. On the 11th, just as we got in column on the direct road to Ringgold, a brigade of infantry came on to it from Chattanooga. Our regiment was in the rear, and the commander of the infantry asked who we were, and we told him. He turned to his adjutant and said, "Tell Colonel Wilder, who is here, and to push them." Our advance was then skirmishing with the rebels at Ringgold, and before the adjutant had time to reach the head of the column, we began to move, passing through Ringgold, where the depot and vast piles of commissary and quartermaster stores were on fire. We saw no more of the infantry general, who said, "Push then." Then through Ringgold, we returned east through a gap in Taylor's Ridge, where 2 long trestle bridges were burning. Passing through the gap, we turned south, and were met by a few shells thrown by the retreating rebels. Our battery took position, fired a few rounds, the rebels limbered up and pushed on, we following. Our advance and the rebels' rear skirmishing at intervals. As we neared Tunnel Hill, some 10 miles south of Ringgold, the scouts in Company A in advance, the rebel cavalry suddenly came sweeping down upon them in full charge. Colonel Kirkpatrick, seeing the dust raised by the advance of the enemy, shouted, "Company A, they are charging us. Dismount and give them hell." Company A, without taking time to form line, dismounted and took to the fence corners. Colonel Kirkpatrick shouting, his battle cry all the while to cheer them on, "Damned them! Damn them! Shoot them in the guts! Go for 'em!" Company A poured such a stream of well-directed bullets from their Spencers into the advancing rebels that they quickly wheeled and dashed away beyond the range of the fire. At this point, one rebel was killed. Company A met and repulsed them gallantly and handsomely. A mile further on the column came to a halt. The brigade dismounted and formed line of battle, and prepared to fight on foot. The 72nd on the right. The line moved forward, until a position was reached from which we could see right into the mouth of the railroad tunnel. Between our line and that tunnel there were thousands of rebels. It was near sundown, and our only safety lay in keeping up a bold front. It seems that the enemy had purposely been drawing us on, and were now waiting for us to charge them, with the expectation that they would take us all in. We did not charge, but held them in check until, after dark, quietly fell back to our horses, moved back behind a large hill, and were ordered not to unsaddle or build fires. Companies E and K of the 72nd were put on picket duty, and were in plain view of the rebels all night, and could hear them talking in camp. On September 12th, by 3 a.m., we were quietly called up and as quietly mounted our horses and rode away, carefully keeping in the pine woods, concealed from the rebels. Companies E and K were left in a very uncomfortable position, for as soon as morning dawned, the rebels began to fire on them. Captain McIntyre, of K, was in command, and immediately began to prepare to follow the brigade, placing part of Company E under commands of Sergeants Remley and Wilhite as rear guard. They slowly retired, the rebels closely pressing them. Our men showed great coolness and courage in disputing every inch of ground and retarding the advance of the rebels until the command got well out of the way. During the gallant affair, almost every man in Company E received close calls, but all got off safe. Some may ask, why did not the rebels rush up and capture these two companies? The answer to this question covers all such questions. The rebels did not know, but these two companies were acting as mere decoys to draw them into the ambush of a strong Union force. For that reason, the rebels moved cautiously. Had they known that E and K were left alone, and the command on the retreat, they might have charged, surrounded, and taken them. But that is just what they did not know. Rash commanders have often dashed on to a little force of the enemy to take it, only to find themselves surrounded by a superior force and compelled to surrender. Our brigade moved back to Ringgold, fully convinced that we had met the enemy in force at Tunnel Hill, and expected to find the infantry there, which were following us yesterday, return with them, and make a more determined attack on the rebels. But the infantry were gone. It was the belief of General Rosecrans that the rebels were in full retreat, and all we had to do was to press them. The magnitude and results of this mistake will be more fully spoken of further on, and it is mentioned to explain the difficulties the 72nd encountered that memorable 12th of September. At Ringgold, Colonel Wilder had orders to report to General Reynolds' division, to which we belonged, and was informed that the division was at Lafayette, or would be that night. We immediately marched for Lafayette on the road that runs nearly south on the west side of Taylor's Ridge, and not many miles from the road we were on the day before, that road being on the east side of the ridge. We knew nothing of the exact situation of the rebel troops, but were confident they were not retreating, but calmly awaiting a favorable opportunity for battle. We proceeded on the road above mentioned, moving rapidly, and by 4 p.m. had made 15 miles, our regiment being near guard. At that hour we suddenly heard heavy skirmishing ahead, and the column came to an abrupt halt. This was some 6 or 8 miles due west of Tunnel Hill, and at the crossing of the road leading to Lee and Gordon's Mills. The 17th Indiana held the advance, Captain Boswell commanding the advance guard. After skirmishing half an hour, the column was still standing. A staff officer came and told Colonel Miller to send forward 4 companies of the 72nd, and A, F, D, and I were ordered forward under Colonel Kirkpatrick, rode to the front in a gallop on the east side of the road to near the head of the column and turned off on a bypath to the east. A half-mile out, we dismounted, formed line of battle, and moved to the southwest, our regimental scouts in advance as skirmishers. It seemed that we had marched almost a mile when we came to a long and rather steep ridge running northwest, the next side to us sparsely covered with stunted jack oaks. We had moved on pretty quick time, till we reached the foot of the ridge and the scouts about halfway up it, when the commander, R.C. Clark, Company I, called out, "Halt." We did so, and we could hear an ominous noise over the ridge, and we knew the rebels were coming, and the vital question was which should reach the top of the ridge first. Clark sang out, "Deploy and charge." Immediately, 10 men were going up the hill like the wind. We followed at double quick. Just as our scouts disappeared over the ridge, we heard a volley, and the quick reply of the Spencers bade us hurry up. Company I deployed forward as skirmishers. In 2 minutes we reached the brow of the hill out of breath and staggering. The first volley from our scouts threw the rebels into confusion, and they hesitated a moment. But seeing the small number of the scouts, they again pressed forward. In a minute, our scouts must have fallen back or been captured, when Clark again commanded, "Dismount and take to the trees." By this time, Company I on the ridge had dressed the line and moved forward. At that moment we heard a most fiendish rebel yell, and they came up the hill like a whirlwind. But we had beaten them and were ready to receive them. What were our scouts to do between 2 forces bent on each other's destructions? We feared to fire lest we should kill our own men. There and then we witnessed an act of the coolest courage we ever expect to see. The scouts fully realized the situation, mounted their horses, and dashed out to the left when the rebels were in 50 feet of them. And strange to say, not one of them got a scratch. Clark's horse was shot. By the time the rebels were in 50 yards of us, and Captain McMurdy, with revolver in one hand and sword in the other, commanded fire, and we did, and never stopped until we gave them our 7 rounds. That was the last word ever spoken by the brave Captain McMurdy, for just as he gave the command, they raised their fiendish yell and charged us again, and the captain fell, pierced by 3 balls. George Brooks also fell mortally wounded, and Jacob Allen fell severely wounded, his leg being broken. The rebels checked up to reload, and were close enough to see how few we were, then dashed at us again, and we should have been quickly swallowed up had not the 3 other companies just then come to our relief. Company F was behind, and in a few feet of our lines. The rebels belched another volley of death upon us. Company I had almost all gotten behind trees, and F, being in plain view at short range, received the force of this fire, before which 9 strong men fell. Had F wavered, or faltered for one moment under this terrible fire, we must all have been lost. But with Captain Dalton at their head firmly commanding, "Steady, boys," they never stopped till in line with I, and then every man went to work with such earnestness and steady, cool determination that the woods seemed a vast sheet of fire. Companies A and D poured in a steady, destructive fire from left oblique, which proved the grain of coffee that broke the camel's back. For the rebels broke in confusion, ran down the ridge, and we poured a leaden hailstorm into their backs, sweeping down many of them. It had not been 30 minutes since our scouts started up that ridge until this fight was over, but with terrible bloody work in that half hour. It was our fortune, in less than a month after this fight, at the Battle of Farmington, to capture a part of the same rebel force that fought us that day, and also 2 years afterwards, just at the close of the war, we pass over this battlefield. We do not hazard exaggeration when we say that for disparity of numbers, severity, and loss of men engaged, the whole history of the war scarcely furnishes a parallel to this battle. On our side, there were just the 4 companies and our regimental scouts engaged. There were scarcely an average of 40 men in each company, or about 160 men all told, while opposed to us was a brigade of 4 full regiments. Estimating 250 men to each regiment would make 7 rebels to each one of us. Yet not a man of our little band faltered or thought of danger, and had the host against us been 10 times greater, and had they lapped around us and swallowed us up, we doubt if a man had thought of running. A few incidents will show the terrible severity of the rebel fire. The writer was near Captain McMurdy, who fell at the first fire of the rebels. Our company was on open ground. We opened on the enemy with all the speed we could command, emptied our Spencer of its 7 loads, and stepped behind a small white oak tree less than a foot in diameter to reload. Just as we were ready to give them another 7 shots, Company F came into line with us. The rebels opened fire again, and 9 men in Company F fell within 10 feet of us, and our little tree was struck 3 times at less than our height. We tell you, if ever there is a time when a man wishes he were as thin as a board, it is when in a place like that was. In addition to the killed and wounded in Company I, Company F lost George W. Mathis, Thomas Cozad, John A. Nixon, and Elisha Holycross, all killed, and had the following wounded: Harvey Schoonover, mortally; George B. Stump, severely in right arm; William A. Schoonover, severely in left side of face; John Munson, flesh wound in left hip. The name of the other man wounded in Company F we did not get. In Company A, Joseph Edskin was killed and the following wounded: Sergeant James Robinson, mortally; Harrison Gomer, left upper arm, severely; John McArdle, left thigh, severely. 2 others whose names we did not get were wounded slightly, making a loss of 8 killed and 10 wounded, a total loss of 18, inside of 15 minutes. Company D fortunately lost none. We killed 30 rebels dead on the field. The number wounded we do not know. The sun was sinking, as in a pillar of blood in the west, and from our position on the high ridge we could see a half-mile over on the road on our right that the rebels were as thick as thieves. We could see their orderlies and officers riding furiously about, forming line for a charge on our head of column to our right and rear, and an occasional shot from our skirmishers over there told us that preparation had been made to receive an attack. We had up to this time no opportunity to get the least idea of the situation, but the longer we stayed, the more painfully apparent it became that we were in a most dangerous and exposed position, and we marveled that we had been sent out there. Rebels enough were in plain view to eat us up, and a very slight move on their part would have cut us off, and we wanted to be relieved. Our dead and dying lay just where they had fallen. We had straightened up our lines a little in advance of where we fought, and lay on the ground watching every leaf and twig that moved in the wind, expecting, momentarily, that the Johnnies would charge us again. But they didn't come. In a few moments, the sun is down, and twilight creeps over us in the smoky forest, and we are commanded to gather up our dead and wounded and fall back as noiselessly as possible. With chagrin at thought of sneaking away from our enemies, and grief at the loss of our comrades, we gathered up our dead and wounded and carried them down to the crossroads. Our wounded we put into ambulances, and our dead we lay in a row on the porch of a large white house which stood near the crossroads. It was dark, and the numerous campfires in every direction admonished us that we were in the midst of a powerful enemy and had no time to lose. In this day of peace, when friendships are rarely cemented by dangers shared in common, it will hardly be possible to realize what overwhelming grief we looked upon that row of 9 brave men with Captain McMurdy at their head, for the last time, and turned away without the privilege of burying them or shedding our tears over their graves. As to Captain McMurdy, he was the writer's captain and particular friend, and we loved him as a brother. He was a brave man and a general favorite in the regiment, and beloved by all who knew him. The question was how to get out of this, and it is not too much to say that Colonel Wilder was much confused, and did not know what to do. Finally, Colonel Miller got us mounted and moved on the road leading west, the 72nd in advance of the brigade. We had not gone over a mile till we heard a sharp halt. Who comes there? Before the man who uttered it knew what he was about, our scouts relieved him of his gun, and brought him to Colonel Miller. From this prisoner, the colonel learned that there was a division of rebels camped not more than a mile ahead of us, and concluded that it would not be safe to go further on that road. But what shall we do? Colonel Miller rode back to a house and pressed an old citizen to pilot us out of that. The citizen objected, and said he did not see how he could, as there were rebels camped in every direction we wished to go. The case was desperate, and the number of shooting irons near the old gentleman's head persuaded him to make the effort. The fence was opened on the north side of the road, and the regiment moved through the field. Company E advanced guard, Sergeant Wilhite in charge of the advance. When in the field we plainly saw the rebel campfires to the left on the road we had abandoned. We moved in a northwest course, and when a mile from the road we could also see rebel campfires on our right. And it was strange that we had not that afternoon run into the rebels' camp there. After going a mile further, Captain Kilbourne of Company E, in command of a detachment of prisoners, was ordered to build campfires on a high ridge, as if the command were going into camp. Everything was dry, and the fires were easily built, but we marched steadily and briskly on, and at midnight struck our pickets a mile east of Lee and Gordon's Mills, passed inside the lines, and immediately lay down to sleep without putting out any pickets, for the first time in many months. We felt very sensibly our narrow escape from capture. And now that we are safely out of it, it is proper to go back and explain how it happened that we were thrown upon the ridge where we had such a sharp fight with the rebels. The first step in the explanation is that our brigade had run full into the rear of the rebel General Polk's corps, and Colonel Wilder thought we were opposed by but a small number of the enemy. The fight we have described was a half-mile southeast of the intersection of the Ringgold and Lafayette Road, and the road from Tunnel Hill to Lee and Gordon's Mills. We were marching on the Ringgold and Lafayette Road for Lafayette when our column met the rebels precisely at Leett's tan yard, not far from Rock Springs, and the fight was always called the Battle of Rock Springs. The first intimation Colonel Wilder seemed to have of the whereabouts of the rebels was when his advance guard ran onto them at these crossroads. He saw that they were in such great force that he could not attack them with a shadow of success, and to retreat would be equally hazardous. He wanted, just then, to be in supporting distance of the left wing of our army, but how to get there was the serious question, as the rebels were on the only road leading to Lee and Gordon's Mills, and his advance had failed to move them from it. Now what was to be done? In this dilemma, he sent back 4 companies of the 72nd to guard against attack from crossroads behind, and ordered us to move off to the east, and then to the southwest and attack the rebels in the rear, in hope of compelling them to abandon their position on the road leading to the mills. The movement was successful, at the fearful cost of blood which has already been told. We returned to camp inside our picket lines. It was about 1 o'clock on the morning of the 13th of September when we lay down to sleep, and about 3 in the morning. We were aroused by very rapid picket firing. We saddled immediately, but the firing ceased. We took breakfast, and shortly after sun moved out in the direction in which we had heard the picket firing. When 3 miles out, we formed line of battle and moved east for some distance, passing over the ridge on which Captain Kilbourne built campfires last night. We now had an explanation of last night's heavy picket firing. The force we fought on the crossroads did not know we had slipped away from them until we had all gone. They followed, and coming to the campfires on the hill, they quietly surrounded them, and at daylight charged the supposed Yankee camp with such fearful yell and discharge of musketry as to arouse us in our camp within our picket lines. We could see their tracks in the ashes made as they marched in line of battle side by side in regular order. They had an easy victory in capturing Yankee ash heaps, but didn't enjoy the Yankee trick. That was Sunday, and we lay in line of battle all day, skirmishing at times very heavily, while skirmishing and artillery firing was in progress off to the right between the infantry and the rebel division we had seen in our front the night before. Late in the evening, we fell back to the west side of Chickamauga Creek, and went into camp not far from Lee and Gordon's Mills. Therefore, our infantry fell back behind the creek and never after attempted to move in that direction. It must be borne in mind that the last 4 days have been such busy ones, and so full of interesting events, that we had not had a moment's time to forage. This is saying a great deal, for it must indeed be a busy time with a man of the 72nd if he don't find some time to forage. And this evening, as it was known that we were going into camp, foraging parties sallied forth in swarms. The infantry was between us and the enemy. Some of the parties had to go a long way, and in their rambles some of them fell into the hands of General Rosecrans's bodyguard, and were arrested as stragglers and taken to the general's headquarters. Without coming out of his tent, the general inquired who they were. The officer informed the general that they claimed to be Wilder's men. "Impossible," said the general. "Wilder's whole command is captured and now on the way to Libby Prison." The officer told the general that they persisted, and that they were Wilder's men in fact. The general then came out to see them, and when assured that they were of the 72nd Indiana, he was astonished beyond measure, and said, "Wilder's men beat the devil anyhow." Turning to the officer, he said, "Take them to Wilder. He's the only man in the army who can manage them." In the squad, there were some from nearly every company in the regiment, but more from I than any other. These were led by Corporal, afterwards Orderly Sergeant Wakeman. On their way to Wilder's headquarters, they resolved to get even with the officer. When they reached Colonel Wilder, he simply asked what regiment they were of, and when told they were of the 72nd, he simply pointed and said, "You will find Colonel Miller over there," and the officer started in that direction. A happy thought struck Corporal Wakeman, and when near the colonel he motioned to his comrades, and they closed up on the trot and came to a front face, and before the officer had time to think, Wakeman dismounted, saluted the colonel, turned to the officer and said, "Colonel Miller, permit me to introduce to your acquaintance Captain Smith, of Colonel Rosecrans's staff." Colonel, caught up in the idea in a moment, and as he advanced to take the captain's hand, he simply motioned to the boys and said, "You can go to your quarters." This attempt to punish men as stragglers when they were only foraging turned out to be the best farce of the campaign. On the 14th, we made another effort to get to our division, which lay at Crawfish Springs, 15 miles southwest of Lee and Gordon's Mills. We started early and reached the division by the middle of that afternoon, and most of us saw our knapsacks for the first time since leaving the Sequatchie Valley, a month lacking 2 days. On the 15th, as we had been in the saddle for a month, we were promised some rest, and accordingly washed our clothes for the first time in 3 weeks and put up our dog tents. The 16th was spent in foraging and shoeing horses. Now, what a great episode, more than an hour long. We're going to try and just keep our notes to about 10 minutes, but let's get straight into them. All right, so let's get into these show notes. I did some research, so let's get into them. So the first thing I've been trying to figure out is tracing the path of this regiment on the campaign, trying to figure out the specific places they are. Has been difficult because names have been changed, or I have to go into like historical society research to try and find them. When they have their first engagement, I believe they came just north of the modern day Sewanee, and then they moved to Tracy City, Tennessee. So that's how they're kind of getting into the Sequatchie Valley in Tennessee. And Georgia and Alabama, it's like this very long, narrow valley that's about 3 miles across. It looks like maybe 2.5, 3 miles, and about 100 miles long. So it's very easy to see why this is a very rich agricultural valley. So, I mean, this is an extension of the Rocky Mountains, the same mountains that are the Scottish Highlands. This is, a piece of that was broken off long, long time ago. But these mountains have been ground down by time, and that's why you can just have them go up and over these very large hills or very small mountains in like a day or two. Not something that would be possible in like the Cascades or the Rockies unless you were hitting a pass. So now, and also at the same time for this area is both Union men and Confederate. Civilian law breaks down, and there's marauders and murdering and looting and just all sorts of crazy stuff. So armies are crisscrossing this area extensively, which makes a lot of sense because we're having constant friction between the Union and Confederate armies. I imagine there are lots of buried treasure in this valley, whether it's discarded bullets, whether it's buried infantry knapsacks because guys got tired of carrying them, or real buried treasure that was hidden to keep away from these marauding armies and roaming soldiers. So it's interesting to see the 72nd's perspective, and also maybe perspective of people who still live in this area. Be very, very fun to go drive through. So I'm following along here, and every time a place is mentioned, I'm trying to find references to the landmarks. One that we do get is Post Tavern, and now it's a replica of the original. It's not serving drinks, but it's at Post Tavern Park and gives you an excellent glimpse of where these men were fighting and camping. The original was torn down, but they rebuilt it using hand tools. So go check it out. Take a look at the photos. It's pretty neat. Very tiny. Friars Island, which is mentioned as like a crossing point, no longer exists because the TVA Chickamauga Dam replaces it. But it's located right where between the dam and the railroad bridge that now currently sit. So you can kind of imagine that section of the area where he's talking about. But yeah, it's just gone, buried underneath the water. The other section that I want to talk about is like that cow that got blown up, the old sow as they refer to it. Just rest in peace. Glad the boys got out, but with, oh my gosh, just a small house getting blown up and a cow being thrown out into little pieces is just rest in peace, little cow. All right. Now, the Battle of Rock Springs, or as they refer to it as the Battle of Rock Springs, is just northeast of Rock Springs, actually. I had to look up where the Leets Spring Tanner was, and for anyone using a map, this engagement takes place just to the right of a local attraction called the Barn of Beaumont. Now, at this time, Rock Springs itself was in control of the rebel hands, and you can see how these soldiers were trying to get away from this. And I totally get it. So the Lee and Gordon's Mills is in this northwest position from where they are, and kind of in a western position is Rock Springs. And the Barn of Beaumont is kind of northeast, and they form this triangle. And on either side, left or right and in front, are Confederate troops. You can kind of see that there was really only this way to get up and over to Lee and Gordon's mills that they escaped. What I really love about this is with the barn on Beaumont, the location that they have this battle is right at that crossroads. And on either side, you can see the ridges that they're talking about. Now, as you go west, they talk about the only road is controlled by the rebels. I think that's the Peavine Road that he's talking about. And they make a northwest escape to get out. And you'll be able to see one of these ridge lines that they're talking about. I think it might be the ridge line just right of Long Hollow Road on a place called Harvest Lane. And I think that might be a location or an area of where they're talking about this, because the road that they're trying to get to is covered by the Confederates. But they make it back, I think probably along Three Notch Road or Red Belt Road up to Lee and Gordon's Mill, which still exists, still got cannons outside of it. Very exciting. There's a road that's nearby called Wilder Road. Obviously one of the sections I'm sure he took on. I know that the Chickamauga battlefield kind of covers all of this area, so I know we'll be more into it in the coming episodes, I'm sure, as we get closer and closer to that battle. But yeah, if they're going to talk about this being one of the hardest fights they've ever done, I definitely wanted to look at where it was. And, you know, these hilltops are pretty undeveloped on either side. So there's a few houses. It would be interesting to go up there and maybe talk to some homeowners and try and get maybe permission to metal detect or something like that. Maybe if there's anybody here who's listening who lives in Tennessee, be a great metal detection section. You might be able to find some loose bullets. There's a lot of it doesn't seem to have been torn up or developed yet. I mean, there's some houses, but not a lot. So maybe if you live out there and one of your houses are in this area, you can let us know if you find anything. But really cool, interesting to see how far they made it before they were forced to turn back, and kind of how deep behind enemy lines. If the pickets are a mile out from Lee and Gordon's mills, then they're not very far from the rebels in general. And that section kind of lands precisely somewhere around the silo at Jean Acres, which is very interesting. There's some heavily wooded areas. And yeah, you'll be able to see that for yourselves. It's on the east side of the West Chickamauga Creek, but very interesting. I am greatly appreciating the amount of detail that we're receiving from this regimental history. We don't always get that. I think for the 155th Regiment at Gettysburg, they're just like, we were like somewhere over here. So it's, except for their actual monuments they put on Little Round Top, but we never really got this kind of incredible detail for the sections that they're walking through, or riding through, I should say. So, well, with that, my fellow mush eaters, thank you for listening. This is going to be the end of our episode. I'm going to get out of here. I got more things to do, but thank you for listening. We're back to a weekly episode, so I hope you enjoy, and I will catch you in the next episode. Now, I've got a couple of things going on the YouTube channel, but nothing too crazy, so feel free to stop by and take a gander. But with that, I'll catch you in the next episode, and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Old John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. For his soul is marching on.